From the very first second she opened that drawer, Maura Nirion's world collapsed. Amongst family photographs and cherished memories, she discovered something that shouldn't exist, something that froze the blood in her veins and dragged the past back with devastating force. It was a simple piece of paper yellowed by time, but capable of destroying an entire life built upon silence. From that moment onwards, what had seemed like a forgotten detail transformed into the beginning of a truth no one would ever have the courage to tell. But what Maura discovered didn't remain trapped in the past. The echo of that revelation traveled across generations, striking those she loved most and unearthing secrets the entire town had sworn they'd buried. And when everything finally came to light, not even she was prepared to face what lay behind that signature. And the most terrifying part is, the true culprit was never who everyone imagined. If you believe the truth always sets you free, wait until you hear what happened to Maura. Subscribe and prepare yourself for a story that will change the way you see silence. Sunday morning dawned calm in Salt Hill, with the Atlantic wind battering against the windows of Maura Nirion's small house. The scent of fresh bread and strong black tea mingled with the sound of her granddaughter Imir's laughter as she set the table for the family lunch. Everything seemed ordinary, peaceful even, until the moment Maura opened the old drawer of the china cabinet, the one she never allowed anyone to touch. Inside lay a silver locket she hadn't seen in decades. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, the cold metal pressing against her palm like a ghost from another life. When she opened it, her heart lurched violently in her chest. There was no photograph inside, instead a yellowed medical prescription bearing her name, written in the firm, unmistakable handwriting of Dr. Cillian O'Dalley, the physician who had cared for her family for 30 years. Maura's breath caught. Why was this hidden here? Why had she never noticed it before? The prescription was dated 1987, a year she could barely remember through the fog of medication and confusion that had clouded so much of her past. Her fingers traced the letters of her own name as if touching them might unlock the memories she'd buried so deeply. The sharp snap of the letterbox shattered her thoughts. Amir walked to the door and returned moments later, holding a brown envelope with no return address. Maura's stomach twisted as she took it from her granddaughter's outstretched hand. The paper felt heavy, deliberate. When she tore it open, the blood drained from her face. Inside was a photocopy of the exact same prescription, but with one chilling difference. The signature field was dated from a day when Maura was certain she'd been unconscious. Completely, utterly unconscious. She remembered waking in a hospital bed with no recollection of how she'd got there. Her husband Sion sitting beside her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Relief? Guilt? Something darker? The Sunday roast grew cold on the table. The voices of her family faded into silence. Outside, the wind howled against the glass as if begging to be let in, as if it carried secrets too heavy for the sky to hold. Maura climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a journey through time itself. The paper shook violently in her hands, the words blurring before her eyes. At the bottom of the page, written in faint pencil, were 4 words that made her knees buckle. You are not alone. Not alone. Not the only one. The phrase circled in her mind like a bird of prey. What did it mean? Who else was there? And why, after all these years, was someone reaching out to her now? She dropped the paper onto the floor, her chest tight with a panic she hadn't felt in years. Walking to the window, she pulled back the lace curtain with trembling fingers and peered out onto the quiet street below. Her heart stopped. Parked directly across from her house, its engine ticking softly in the cold air, was an old car, the exact make and model that Dr. Cillian used to drive when she was young. The same pale green color, the same dent on the passenger door, and behind the wheel, barely visible through the tinted glass, sat the silhouette of a man, watching, waiting. Maura stumbled backwards, her hand clutching her chest. Downstairs, Ymir called out, asking if she was all right. But Maura couldn't answer. She couldn't move. All she could do was stare at that car, at the shadow inside it, and feel the cold grip of a past she thought she'd escaped tightening around her throat once more. The wind screamed against the window. The prescription lay forgotten on the floor. And outside, the car's headlights blinked once. A signal, a threat, or perhaps a promise. He knew she'd found it. And now he wanted her to know he was still there. Decades earlier, in 1972, Maura had been only 24 years old when she first met Dr. Cillian O'Dalley. Galway was a small city then, where everyone knew everyone's business, and his surgery near St. Ignatius Parish was considered a pillar of trust in the community. People spoke his name with reverence, as if he were more than a doctor, a guardian angel in a waistcoat and tie. Maura had been shy, devout, and newly married to Sean O'Callaghan, a charismatic man who owned a small fishing tackle shop down by the docks. He had a smile that could charm the birds from the trees, and a way of making her feel like the luckiest woman in Galway. But after she lost their first child, a tiny, perfect boy who never took his first breath, something inside her shattered into pieces so small she couldn't find them all. The grief consumed her. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped attending Mass. Sean grew worried, then frustrated, then desperate. One afternoon, gripping her shoulders with hands that felt too strong, he insisted she see Dr. O'Dallai. "He'll take care of you like his own daughter," Sean had said, his voice firm but his eyes distant. "Everyone says he's a miracle worker." Maura went because she had no fight left in her. The surgery smelled of disinfectant and old books, and the waiting room was filled with women, always women, sitting quietly with their hands folded in their laps. When Cillian finally called her name, his voice was smooth as honey. He offered her tea and a reassuring smile that seemed practiced, perfected over years of use. But when he took her hands in his to check her pulse, holding them far longer than necessary, Maura's stomach turned cold. His touch was impersonal, calculated, devoid of warmth. It felt less like care and more like ownership. She told herself she was imagining things, that grief had made her paranoid. But deep down, in a place she couldn't yet name, she knew something was terribly wrong. The visits became weekly, then twice weekly. Maura would return home exhausted, her mind foggy and her body heavy, unable to remember much of what happened during the appointments. Sean never questioned it. In fact, he seemed pleased. He'd pat her head absently and say, "The doctor knows what's best for you, love." And strangely, inexplicably, his business began to thrive. New customers appeared. Debts were forgiven. Opportunities opened like doors in a house she'd never been invited into. One evening, as Maura undressed for bed, she noticed Sean glancing at his watch, a silver piece with an engraved back. Her heart stuttered. She'd seen that watch before. Dr. Cillian wore one exactly like it. The realization crept over her like frost on a window pane. Her husband wasn't just grateful to the doctor. He was involved, connected, complicit. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing down on her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat like stones. And sleep, when it finally came, brought nightmares of cold hands and locked doors. The following morning there was a knock at the door. Maura answered it, still in her dressing gown, her hair uncombed. Dr. Cillian stood on the doorstep, immaculate in his wool coat, holding a small wrapped package tied with ribbon. "For you," he said softly, his smile never reaching his eyes. A token of care. With trembling hands she unwrapped it. Inside was a silver necklace with a locket, the exact same locket her father had given her on her 16th birthday. The one that had disappeared years ago, the one she'd searched for desperately and mourned in silence. Cillian's smile widened as he watched the color drain from her face. "I thought you might like to have this back," he said, his voice a whisper that chilled her to the bone. "After all, I've always looked after the things that matter to you." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Maura standing in the doorway, clutching the locket that should never have been in his possession. Behind her, Sean called out from the kitchen, asking who was at the door. She couldn't answer. She couldn't breathe, because in that moment, she understood. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't care. This was control, and it had been from the very beginning. The locket became a symbol of a new kind of imprisonment. Maura wore it because refusing would have raised questions she couldn't answer, questions that would have made Sean angry, or worse, disappointed. Dr. Cillian called it a form of protection, a talisman, for fragile women who need watching over. Sean, proud as a peacock, began introducing the doctor as a dear family friend. The neighbors admired them for having such influential connections. The parish, always so attentive to gossip and propriety, saw in Maura a fortunate woman blessed with excellent care. But inside the house, silence grew like mold on damp walls, spreading into every corner, suffocating every conversation that might have led to truth. The appointments continued, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. Maura learned to prepare herself mentally before each visit, to lock away the part of herself that felt anything at all, to become a hollow vessel that could endure whatever came next. The surgery always smelled the same: antiseptic, old leather, and something else she could never quite name. Fear, perhaps, or shame. One autumn afternoon, whilst waiting in the reception area, Maura overheard two nurses whispering behind the front desk. She kept her eyes fixed on the outdated magazine in her lap, but her ears strained to catch every word. "He has a way with his patients," one nurse murmured, her tone uncertain. "Perhaps too much of a way if you ask me." "Shh, don't say such things," the other hissed. "He's respected. People trust him. That's precisely what worries me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maura's hands went cold. When Dr. Cillian emerged from his consulting room and called her name, she looked up and met his eyes. He smiled, that same calculated, practiced smile, and she realized with sickening clarity that he'd heard the nurses too, and he didn't care. In fact, he seemed amused. The years bled together after that. Sedatives, hormonal adjustments, checkups with no records, prescriptions that appeared in her handbag without her remembering receiving them. Maura learned to dissociate her body from her soul, to float somewhere above herself whilst he conducted his examinations. She became an expert at staring at the ceiling tiles, counting them over and over, finding patterns in the cracks that spiderwebbed across the plaster. Xian's business flourished beyond all expectation. He bought new boats, hired more staff, and began attending functions at the yacht club where men in expensive suits shook his hand and slapped his back. At night he'd come home smelling of whiskey and cigars, kiss her absently on the forehead, and fall asleep within minutes. He never asked about the appointments anymore. He didn't need to. Everything was going exactly as planned, just not her plan. One Sunday after Mass, as Maura stood in the churchyard watching families scatter towards their Sunday dinners, Mrs. Noreen Walsh approached her. Noreen was known throughout Galway for her sharp tongue and sharper instincts, a woman who saw through pretense like glass. "Maura, love," Noreen said quietly, placing a weathered hand on her arm. "Walk with me a moment." They strolled towards the old cemetery, away from prying ears. The wind carried the scent of sea salt and rain. "You're not the first woman to tell me these things," Noreen said finally, her voice low and urgent. "There have been others, many others, but they're all too frightened to speak." Maura's breath caught in her throat. "What things?" "I haven't said anything." "You don't need to, child. I can see it in your eyes. The same look I saw in my own sister's eyes before she—" Noreen's voice broke. "Before she took her own life." The world tilted. Maura gripped a headstone to steady herself, the cold marble biting into her palm. "You need to write it all down," Noreen whispered fiercely. "Every detail you remember. Hide it somewhere safe. Because one day when you're strong enough, you'll need that proof." That night, whilst Xian snored in their bed, Maura sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. Her hand shook so badly she could barely form the letters, but she forced herself to write. Every appointment, every touch, every moment of confusion and shame. She wrote until dawn crept through the windows, until her hand cramped and her tears had dried into salt tracks on her cheeks. When she finished, she carefully tucked the notebook into the lining of the old sofa in the sitting room, pushing it deep into the stuffing where no one would think to look. The next morning, she woke with a strange sense of relief. The truth existed now, in written form. She wasn't imagining it. It was real. But when she went to check on the notebook that evening, her blood turned to ice. The sofa lining had been carefully opened and stitched back together, and the notebook was gone. When Xian died in 2005, Maura felt something she'd never expected to feel at her husband's funeral: relief. It crashed over her like a wave, immediate and overwhelming, followed swiftly by crushing guilt that made her knees buckle beside his coffin. She cried because it was expected, because the entire parish was watching, because widows were supposed to be devastated. But the tears weren't for him. They were for the woman she'd been before she met him, the girl who'd believed in love and safety and the goodness of people. She sold the fishing shop within a month. The buyers were eager, almost too eager, and she didn't ask questions. She took the money and moved to a small flat in Claddagh, overlooking the harbor where swans glided across the water like ghosts. For the first time in 33 years, she lived alone. No husband, no doctor, no appointments. Peace, she thought, might finally be possible. But peace, Maura learned, was not something people like her were allowed to have. 2 weeks after the funeral, she found a bouquet of white lilies on her doorstep. No card, no note, just flowers. The same flowers that had decorated Seon's coffin. Her hands shook as she carried them inside, and when she separated the stems to put them in water, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant and cruel. "I'm still taking care of you." The flowers went straight into the bin, but the note stayed in her pocket, burning against her skin like a brand. That same week the phone calls began. Always at night, always when she was alone. She'd answer, her voice tentative, and hear nothing but the sound of waves crashing against rocks. The sea. Always the sea. The line would stay open for exactly 1 minute, then disconnect with a soft click. Mora knew it wasn't coincidence. Cillian had always loved the sea. He'd spoken about it during those terrible appointments, describing his holiday home in Connemara, the way the Atlantic looked at sunset, how the sound of waves could calm even the most troubled mind. She'd learned to hate the sea because of him. Determined to escape the past once and for all, she packed her belongings and moved to Cork, where nobody knew her name or her history. She found work in a charity shop, made polite conversation with customers, and kept to herself. For 18 months she almost believed she'd succeeded in disappearing. Then on a gray Tuesday afternoon, as she returned from the shops with bags of groceries weighing down her arms, she found a man standing at her door. Dr. Cillian O'Dallai, decades older, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane, but unmistakably him. The same sharp eyes, the same thin smile, the same air of absolute certainty that he owned whatever space he occupied. "Mora," he said warmly, as if they were old friends reuniting. "I heard you'd been unwell. Thought I'd check on my favorite patient." The grocery bag slipped from her fingers. Apples rolled across the pavement. A jar of jam shattered, spreading red across the concrete like blood. "How did you find me?" Her voice came out as a whisper, barely audible above the wind. "Oh, my dear," he chuckled softly. "Did you really think you could hide from me, after everything we've been through together?" Mora tried to close the door, but he moved with surprising speed for his age, wedging his cane into the doorframe. His face leaned close to hers, and she could smell the familiar scent of his cologne. Expensive, suffocating, unchanged by time. "You know what we have doesn't end just because you run away," he whispered. "Some bonds are permanent, Mora. Surely you understand that by now." She shoved the door with all her strength, forcing him back, and slammed it shut. The lock clicked. The chain slid into place, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. When she finally gathered the courage to retrieve her spilled groceries, she noticed something she'd missed in her panic. One of the bags had split open, and amongst the scattered items was a brown envelope, identical to the one that had arrived in Salt Hill all those months ago. It hadn't been in her shopping. She was certain of it. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. The envelope was sealed, unmarked, and heavier than it should have been. Inside, she knew, would be another piece of the puzzle, another fragment of the nightmare she couldn't escape. Outside her door, she heard footsteps retreating slowly down the hall. Then, just before they faded completely, Cillian's voice drifted back to her, soft and poisonous. "Read it carefully, Mora. And remember, I'm always watching over you." The footsteps disappeared. The building fell silent, and Mora, alone in her small flat with the envelope clutched to her chest, understood with terrifying clarity that some prisons have no walls, some chains can't be seen, and some monsters never die. They simply wait. The encounter with Dr. Cillian had been brief, but it was enough to resurrect nightmares Mora had believed she'd buried deep enough to never surface again. That night she dreamt of the old surgery, the relentless ticking of the clock marking every agonizing second, the sharp chemical smell of disinfectant that seemed to coat her throat, and those cold, calculating hands pressing against her temples as if trying to read her thoughts. She woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was dark except for the amber glow of the street lamp outside. And there, on her bedside table where it definitely hadn't been before, sat the brown envelope, sealed, waiting. Mora's breath came in shallow bursts as she reached for it with trembling fingers. The paper felt thick, expensive, deliberate. She tore it open with more violence than necessary, as if attacking the envelope might somehow hurt the person who'd sent it. Inside were photographs, old ones, their edges yellowed with age, The colors faded to sepia tones that made them look like artifacts from another century. But Maura recognized herself immediately. Young, terribly young, sitting on an examination table in a paper gown that offered no dignity, no protection. And there, standing beside her with one hand resting possessively on her shoulder, was Dr. Cillian, decades younger, but unmistakably him. Behind them both, partially obscured by shadow but clearly visible, stood Xian, her husband, smiling, not the uncertain smile of a worried spouse, but something else entirely. Complicit, knowing, pleased. The date stamp on the photograph read March 1987. The exact month Maura had been hospitalized for what everyone called a nervous breakdown. She'd woken in a hospital bed with no memory of how she'd got there, her body aching in ways she couldn't explain, her mind wrapped in cotton wool that wouldn't lift for weeks. But she'd never consented to photographs, never even knew they existed. In the bottom corner of the image, someone had written in pencil, "First session, first," which meant there had been others. The floor seemed to drop away beneath her feet. Maura sank onto the edge of her bed, the photographs scattering across the duvet like accusations. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. How many sessions had there been? What had they done to her whilst she was unconscious? And why, dear God, why? Had Xian been there, watching, allowing it? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, each one more horrifying than the last. Sleep became impossible after that. Maura spent her nights pacing the small flat, jumping at every sound, seeing shadows where there were none. During the day, she moved through her routine like a ghost, barely present, always looking over her shoulder. On Sunday, desperate for something resembling peace, she went to St. Finbarr's Cathedral. The ancient stone walls had always offered comfort, a sense of permanence that reminded her some things endured despite human cruelty. She slipped into the confessional booth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. The young priest listened patiently as she spoke in vague, careful terms about guilt and past sins and feeling haunted. When she finished, he offered the expected platitudes. "Give it all to God, my child. He alone can lift these burdens from your shoulders. Trust in his mercy." But mercy, Maura thought bitterly, seemed to be reserved for men who wore collars and white coats, not for the women they destroyed. She left the cathedral feeling emptier than when she'd arrived. The afternoon sun was weak, struggling through gray clouds that threatened rain. As she walked towards the bus stop, she became aware of someone watching her, a woman in a dark overcoat standing near the old cemetery gates. Their eyes met. The woman was tall, perhaps in her 60s, with a face carved by sorrow and determination in equal measure. She began walking towards Maura with purposeful strides, and every instinct screamed at Maura to run, but her feet stayed rooted to the pavement. "You were his patient too, weren't you?" the woman said quietly when she drew close. "It wasn't a question. I can always tell. It's in the eyes, the way you hold yourself, as if you're always waiting for the next blow." Maura's throat closed. She managed a small nod. "He did the same to me," the woman continued, her voice steady despite the pain etched in every word. 30 years ago, and to my sister before me, and to God knows how many others." Before Maura could respond, the woman pressed a small wooden box into her hands. The wood was old, scarred, held together with tarnished brass hinges. "You'll know what to do with this," the woman whispered, "when you're ready." Then she turned and disappeared into the flow of people on the street, moving with the ease of someone who'd spent years learning how to vanish. Maura stood frozen, clutching the box to her chest. Her hands shook so violently she could barely maintain her grip. She waited until she was back in her flat, door locked, curtains drawn, before she dared to open it. Inside, carefully preserved and organized by date, were letters, dozens of them, all written in the same elegant handwriting she'd come to despise, all addressed to different women, patients from towns and villages scattered across the west of Ireland. The letters described special treatment programs and personal rehabilitation methodologies. They spoke of trust and care and healing in language that would have sounded compassionate to anyone who didn't understand the sinister reality beneath the words. Each letter ended the same way. "This is our secret. No one would understand the special bond we share." Maura's hands trembled as she read through them one after another, each name searing itself into her memory. Margaret, Siobhan, Roisin, Deirdre, Catherine, Mary. So many names, so many women, so many lives destroyed whilst everyone around them praised the good doctor for his dedication and compassion. The box slipped from her lap, letters spilling across the floor like fallen leaves. And Maura understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from facing an unbearable truth, that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger, darker, more monstrous than she'd ever imagined. And somewhere out there, other women were still carrying these secrets, still believing they were alone. The letters became Maura's obsession. She read them over and over, memorizing the names, the dates, the carefully coded language that spoke of violation whilst masquerading as medical care. Each letter was a bomb waiting to explode, evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. But evidence meant nothing without someone who knew how to use it, someone with the authority and courage to stand against a man who'd spent his entire career building an unassailable reputation. There was only one person Maura trusted enough to show this to, Dr. Aine Maxwibne, her current GP. Aine was different from the doctors of Maura's past, younger, direct, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a manner that combined clinical precision with genuine warmth. She listened when Maura spoke, really listened. Instead of simply waiting for her turn to prescribe something, Maura made an appointment under the pretense of a routine checkup. When the examination room door closed and they were alone, she placed the wooden box on the desk between them like an offering to the gods of justice. "I need you to look at something," Maura said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I need you to tell me if I'm going mad or if what I think happened actually did." Aine's expression shifted from professional concern to something deeper as Maura explained, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, about the photographs, the letters, the decades of treatments she couldn't remember. She showed the doctor everything, the prescription from the locket, the copies that had arrived in unmarked envelopes, the medical records she'd managed to obtain through persistent requests to the HSE. Aine examined each document with the methodical attention of someone trained to see patterns in chaos. Her face grew progressively paler, her jaw tightening with each page she turned. "I need time to verify these," she said finally. "Some of these medications, they're not standard prescriptions, and these signatures—" She looked up at Maura, and there was fury in her eyes, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "Give me 2 weeks. I'll contact the HSE directly and request your complete medical history." Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Maura barely slept, barely ate, jumping every time the phone rang or someone knocked at the door. She kept the wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, checking on it obsessively to make sure it was still there, that she hadn't dreamt the whole thing. When Aine finally called, it was late evening. Her voice sounded strained, tight with barely suppressed emotion. "Maura, I need you to come to the surgery. Now. Tonight. We need to talk in person." The surgery was empty when Maura arrived. The waiting room lights dimmed, chairs standing in neat rows like silent witnesses. Aine met her at the door and locked it behind her, then led her to the consulting room where documents were spread across every available surface. "I've been through your medical records," Aine began without preamble, "multiple times, and I've consulted with colleagues who specialize in cases like this." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Maura, these medications you were prescribed, they're not what he claimed they were. Some are powerful sedatives, others are used to induce temporary amnesia, and there are procedures listed here that," her voice cracked, "that you never signed consent forms for." The room tilted. Maura gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "But that's not the worst part," Aine continued, her anger now clearly visible. "Someone altered your records. Recently. Within the past few years. Whole sections have been rewritten, dates changed, signatures forged. Someone's been systematically trying to cover their tracks. We need to report this," Maura whispered. "Go to the authorities. To the medical council. Something." Aine's expression was pained. "I want to. God knows I want to. But Maura, you need to understand what we're up against. Dr. O'Dale has connections everywhere. In hospitals, in government, in the church. When a man like him falls, he doesn't fall alone. He takes everyone down with him, and the people who've been protecting him all these years." She shook her head. "They'll fight back. Hard. So we do nothing?" Maura's voice rose despite herself. "We let him keep doing this to other women?" "No," Aine said firmly. "We build a case so strong they can't ignore it. But it takes time. And you need to be prepared for what that means. Are you ready for everyone in your life to know what happened? For your family to find out? For newspapers to print your name? Maura thought of her granddaughter Ymir, of the life she'd carefully constructed from the ruins of her past. Then she thought of all the names in those letters, all the women who'd carried this weight alone. Yes, she said, I'm ready. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next evening, Maura returned to her flat to find the door hanging open, its lock splintered. Her heart hammered as she pushed it wider, stepping into chaos. The furniture had been overturned, drawers emptied, belongings scattered. Whoever had been here hadn't bothered trying to hide their presence. This was a message. The flowers from her windowsill lay crushed on the floor, soil spreading like a dark stain across the carpet. And the sofa, the same sofa where decades ago she'd hidden that first notebook, had been torn open, its stuffing pulled out in violent handfuls. Maura stumbled forward on shaking legs, dropping to her knees beside the destruction. There, wedged between the remaining cushions, was a single page. She recognized it immediately, a page from her original notebook, the one that had disappeared all those years ago, the one she'd thought was lost forever. The handwriting was her own, young and frightened, describing an appointment in devastating detail. But across the top, in different ink, someone had written, "Don't forget what we did for you." Not I, we. The implication crashed over her like a wave. This wasn't just Cillian, there were others involved, protecting him, enabling him, making sure the secret stayed buried. And they knew she was trying to expose them. Outside, in the gathering darkness, Maura heard the sound of a car engine starting. She ran to the window just in time to see a familiar pale green vehicle pulling away from the curb, its headlights cutting through the dusk like predatory eyes. He wanted her to know he could reach her anywhere, anytime, and that nowhere, no matter how far she ran, would ever truly be safe. By 2014, after years of Dr. Ein's methodical documentation and quiet lobbying, the case finally reached the Medical Council in Dublin. The hearing room was packed to capacity. Local journalists clutching notebooks, former patients sitting with their hands folded tightly in their laps, and curious onlookers drawn by whispers of scandal. The air felt thick with decades of suppressed truth finally demanding to be heard. Dr. Cillian O'Dalley sat at the respondents' table, flanked by an expensive solicitor whose suit probably cost more than Maura's yearly pension. Despite his age, he was well into his 80s now, Cillian maintained an air of wounded dignity, his posture upright, his expression one of bemused patience, as if this entire proceeding were an unfortunate misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up. And there, glinting on his wrist, was the same silver watch he'd worn for 50 years. Maura sat in the witness section, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to appear calm. She'd dressed carefully that morning, a simple navy dress, her gray hair neatly pinned, no jewelry except for her wedding ring, which she wore more from habit than sentiment. She wanted to look credible, composed, like someone whose testimony couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a confused elderly woman. When the presiding officer called her name, the room fell silent. Every eye turned towards her. Maura rose slowly, feeling the weight of their collective gaze, and walked to the witness stand. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to keep moving forward, one step at a time. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, as if she'd come all this way to lie. "Mrs. O'Callaghan," the officer began, her voice formal but not unkind, "please tell the tribunal, in your own words, what happened." Maura took a breath that seemed to come from the very bottom of her soul. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, each word falling into the hushed room like a stone into still water. "For 30 years," she began, "people told me I was ill, fragile, that I needed special care, special treatment. They made me believe there was something fundamentally wrong with me, something broken that only Dr. O'Dalley could fix." She paused, her throat tight. "But the truth is, I wasn't sick. What I had wasn't an illness. What I had was fear." She looked directly at Cillian as she spoke. He met her gaze without flinching, that same slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as if they were sharing a private joke. "Fear of speaking out," Maura continued, her voice growing stronger. "Fear of not being believed. Fear of what my husband would say, what the neighbors would think, what the church would do. That fear was the real disease. And Dr. O'Dalley knew exactly how to use it. The room remained silent, but she could feel the tension building, the collective held breath of everyone present. He took my trust and turned it into a weapon. He took my vulnerability and made it into a prison. And he did it with the full knowledge and cooperation of people who should have protected me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officer raised her hand for silence. Then, from the back of the room, someone stood up. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected that everyone turned to look. It was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean, with dark hair graying at the temples. Mora's heart stopped. She knew that face. She'd given birth to it, raised it, loved it despite everything. Lorcan O'Callaghan, her son. "I need to say something," Lorcan announced, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't wait for permission before continuing. "I'm a doctor, trained at University College Dublin, practiced for nearly 20 years, and the man who inspired me to pursue medicine, the man whose example I tried to follow," his voice cracked, "was the same man who destroyed my mother." The room erupted in whispers. Cameras flashed. The officer called for order, but Lorcan kept speaking, his words tumbling out with the force of a confession too long held back. "I didn't know. For years I didn't know. I saw him as a mentor, a brilliant physician, someone who truly cared about his patients. And in trying to emulate him in following his methods," he closed his eyes, his face contorted with anguish. "I hurt people too. Not in the same ways. Not with the same cruelty, but I prioritized my authority over their autonomy. I dismissed their concerns. I made them feel small and powerless, just as he did." Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly at Mora, "I'm so sorry. For not seeing. For not protecting you. For being his legacy instead of yours." Mora couldn't breathe. The room swam before her eyes. She gripped the edge of the witness stand, trying to anchor herself to something solid whilst her world tilted sideways. The officer attempted to regain control, but the damage was done. The carefully maintained facade of professional decorum had cracked wide open, revealing the raw, bleeding heart of the matter beneath. Mora found her voice again, stronger now, fueled by her son's courage. "In 1987, she said clearly, Dr. O'Dalley took something from me that not even my husband's death could restore. He took my sense of self, my ability to trust, my belief that my body belonged to me. And this," she reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the one that had started everything. "This belonged to my father. It was given to me on my 16th birthday, and it disappeared shortly after I became Dr. O'Dalley's patient. He returned it to me years later as a gift, as if he hadn't stolen it in the first place, as if marking me as his possession was an act of kindness." She held the locket up for everyone to see, her hand remarkably steady now. "He didn't just abuse his position. He stole pieces of our lives and wore them like trophies. And he did it for decades, with impunity, because everyone was too frightened or too complicit to stop him." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of someone weeping quietly in the back row. Then, like a dam breaking, an elderly woman in the third row stood up. Her voice shook, but it carried through the room with surprising strength. "He did the same to my sister," she cried out. "In 1981, she never recovered. She took her own life 2 years later, and we were told it was because she was mentally unstable. But it wasn't. It was him. It was what he did to her." Another woman stood, then another, then 3 more. Voices rose like a chorus, each one adding their story to the collective testimony, each one confirming what Mora had known all along. She was never alone. The tribunal descended into controlled chaos. The officer called for multiple recesses. Cillian's solicitor demanded order, claimed his client was being ambushed, insisted this was all highly irregular. But it was too late. The truth, once given voice, could not be silenced again. And Mora, standing at the witness stand with her father's locket clutched in her hand, finally understood what freedom felt like. The complaints multiplied like spring flowers after rain. Within weeks of the tribunal hearing, over 60 women came forward with similar stories spanning 4 decades. The medical council had no choice but to act. Dr. Cillian O'Dalley's medical license was revoked, his name struck from the register, with the kind of finality usually reserved for the most egregious violations of trust. The man who'd spent 50 years being praised as a pillar of the community, died alone 6 months later in his holiday home in Connemara, his reputation in tatters, his legacy reduced to ash. Maura didn't attend the funeral. She had no desire to stand over his grave and pretend to mourn, no need for the hollow closure that ritual might provide. Instead, she spent that gray November morning sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a blank piece of paper, writing the first of many letters. The letters went to women whose names she'd found in that wooden box, women she'd never met, but with whom she shared an unbreakable bond forged in trauma and survival. She wrote to the sisters of women who hadn't survived, to daughters who'd watched their mothers deteriorate without understanding why, to granddaughters who deserved to know the truth about the shadows that had haunted their families for generations. In each letter, she extended an invitation to meet, to talk, to simply exist in a space where their pain would be acknowledged rather than dismissed. She suggested the old community hall in Cork, a neutral space that belonged to no one and therefore could belong to all of them. On the day of the gathering, Maura arrived early. She'd expected perhaps a dozen women, those brave enough or angry enough to face their shared history. She'd arranged chairs in a circle, prepared tea and biscuits, tried to create an atmosphere of safety and warmth. What she got was overwhelming. They began arriving at 2:30, and they didn't stop. By 3 o'clock, there were over 50 women crowded into the hall, ranging in age from their 30s to their 80s. Some came alone, others brought sisters, daughters, friends for support. They carried flowers, photographs, old medical records stuffed into manila folders, jewelry they'd been given by the doctor, tokens of his special care that had felt like brands marking them as his property. Maura stood at the front of the room, momentarily speechless. The sheer number of them, the visible evidence of the scope of his crimes, was both heartbreaking and somehow inexplicably beautiful. Because they were here, they'd survived. They'd found the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light. Among the crowd, Maura spotted the woman in the dark overcoat, the one who'd given her the wooden box outside St. Finbarr's Cathedral. She made her way through the gathering and stood before Maura with tears streaming down her weathered face. "I'm Orla Ní Brónain," she said quietly. "I was a nurse at Dr. O'Dale's surgery for 15 years. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. I falsified prescriptions. I scheduled appointments I knew would end badly. I looked the other way when I should have intervened. I did all of it because I was frightened of what would happen if I didn't." Her voice broke. "I've carried that guilt for 30 years, and I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But seeing you here today, Maura, seeing what you've built from the wreckage he created, it gives me something I thought I'd lost forever. It gives me hope." The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a woman spoke. "You were a victim too." Another voice joined in. "He controlled all of us, in different ways, but he controlled us all." Slowly, painfully, the stories began to flow. Women spoke of appointments they couldn't remember, of medications that made them feel disconnected from their own bodies, of years lost to confusion and self-doubt. They spoke of husbands who'd benefited from their doctor's care, of families who'd dismissed their concerns, of a system that had valued a man's reputation over their safety and dignity. They cried, they raged. They laughed sometimes at the absurdity of it all, how they'd been made to feel crazy when they were the sanest people in the room, how they'd apologized for their own victimization, how they'd spent decades believing the lies because the truth was too terrible to accept. And through it all, Maura listened, really listened, the way no one had listened to her for 50 years. When the gathering finally ended, hours later than planned, the women didn't want to leave. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans to meet again, formed bonds that would last the rest of their lives. The isolation that had been their prison was shattered, replaced by something stronger, community. In the weeks that followed, Maura used the compensation money from her settlement with the medical council, money that felt both inadequate and somehow appropriate, to establish the White Hand Center. It was a small operation at first, just a few rooms in a converted townhouse, offering free psychological support and advocacy services for elderly women in the community. But it grew quickly, fueled by donations from women who understood its importance and volunteers who'd lived through similar experiences. On the day of the official opening, Maura stood at the entrance greeting visitors. Her son Lorcan was there, having left his practice in Dublin to work part-time at the center, trying to atone for the harm he'd unknowingly perpetuated. Her granddaughter Ymir cut the ribbon, bright-eyed and proud, too young to fully understand the darkness that had necessitated this place, but old enough to recognize its importance. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Mora found an envelope tucked into her coat pocket. No name, no postmark. Inside was a single handwritten note on plain paper. I was his patient too, for 7 years. I never told anyone, not even my husband. I thought I'd take the secret to my grave. But then I heard what you did, how you spoke up, how you refused to stay silent even when it would have been easier. You gave me something I thought was gone forever. You gave me back my voice. Thank you for your courage. It saved more lives than you'll ever know. The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Mora carefully folded it and placed it inside the silver locket. Her father's locket, reclaimed at last. She stood at the window, watching the evening sun paint the Cork skyline in shades of amber and rose. For the first time in half a century, she felt the warmth reach all the way down to her bones. Her hands, for so long cold and trembling, were finally, blessedly warm. She thought of all the women she'd never meet, the ones who'd carry their secrets to their graves, the ones who'd survived but would never speak. She thought of the system that had failed them, the institutions that had protected their abuser, the society that had valued respectability over truth. But mostly, she thought of the women in that community hall, their faces wet with tears and radiant with relief. She thought of Orla, seeking redemption, of Lorcan, choosing healing over pride, of all the voices that had finally been heard. The past couldn't be changed. The damage couldn't be undone. But the future, that was something they could shape together. Mora closed the locket with a soft click and smiled. Not a small, frightened smile, but something genuine and defiant and utterly beautifully free. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. And somewhere in homes across Ireland, women who'd spent lifetimes believing they were alone were beginning to understand they never had been. The silence was broken, and in its place, finally, was truth. There are wounds that time doesn't heal. It only teaches us how to live with them. Mora ní Riain spent her entire life believing that silence was synonymous with strength, until she discovered that silence, sometimes, is what keeps evil alive. When she finally decided to speak, she didn't do it for revenge but for love. Love for herself, for all the women who'd once been silenced, and for those who still believe that courage means shouting, even when the entire world asks you to be quiet. And what about you? Would you have had the courage to open that drawer, to confront the people you'd always believed you loved? Or would you have remained silent, just to keep up appearances? The truth is, no one emerges unscathed when they choose to stay quiet, but some become eternal when they choose to speak. If this story touched your heart like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it and follow the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Because sometimes it's in stories like this that we find the strength we thought we'd lost.